This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. One of the topics we like to look at from time to time, and will continue to do so, is identity politics. And so it is in this episode. At the core of identity politics is the conceit that you can group voters according to some essential characteristic they possess: their race, their sex, their ethnic origins, their educational level, their geographic region. And also, it's the belief that you can win elections by playing to those groups and promising to represent them and their needs. And so in the last election, the Democratic Party platform specifically named several groups made up of people who matter to the party's would-be policymakers. Native Americans were named, women, people identifying under LGBTQ, the disabled, Black and Latino people, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Island people. But one group it did not name was men, just men. And while Kamala Harris ultimately started talking about what she called an opportunity agenda for Black men, it again wasn't about just men overall. Richard Reeves, who has debated with us, in fact, and specializes in the challenges that face men and boys, made a trenchant point a few weeks before the election writing for Politico. He said this: "The problem seems to be that many men simply don't see much recognition of their issues or even of their identity on the political left." Now, what we know about men in the last election is how they voted. More than half of them voted for Donald Trump, even some who might have been expected to do otherwise. Quoting CBS News, exit polling finds that President-elect Donald Trump won white men under 30, the so-called bro vote, by 7 percentage points. Also, more young Black and Latino men voted for Trump this time than voted for him in 2020, even though Harris still had majorities in those categories. And on the whole, it could be said that a shift among younger men towards the right, men from Gen Z, helped Trump to win the election. Which raises a question for Democrats. Is the party somehow overlooking an opportunity to make a more direct appeal to men as a group, as an identity group? Is there a winning strategy around men waiting to be discovered and put into practice? Or would that just be more identity politics, which has been proving how successful for the Democrats? In this episode, these are the questions we're going to dig into in the form of a debate focused around this specific prompt question: could identity politics help the Democrats engage men? So let's meet our debaters. Answering yes to that question, again, it's could identity politics help Democrats engage men? I want to welcome Jackson Katz, who's an educator and co-founder of Mentors in Violence Prevention. Jackson, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
And here to answer no again to that very same question, I want to welcome Thomas Chatterton Williams, staff writer at The Atlantic, a visiting professor of humanities at Bard College, and a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and also a returning debater. Thomas, thanks so much for joining us once again on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So let's get on to our opening statements. We want to ask each of you to take a few minutes to explain why you're answering yes or no to our prompt question. You are answering yes, Jackson. Identity politics could help Democrats engage men. Here's your chance, please, to tell us why.
Well, first, thank you very much, John, and thank you, Thomas. I look forward to this debate and dialogue. And I think this is a really incredibly important topic, and I'm appreciative that we have the opportunity to have this discussion. First, I want to say I understand that people have concerns. Many people have concerns about dividing people into identity categories, and rather than focusing on some universalist concerns like the economy or some other overarching ways in which we're connected. And so I share some of those concerns. But I think it's important to say that all politics are really identity politics. And I think the reason why we're having this conversation now is because people are finally realizing, including in the Democratic Party and in the commentariat, they're finally realizing that the failure of the Democrats and progressives more generally, and liberals, to talk to men, to speak to men, to create narratives and stories that include men, including white men, in the conversations about politics and about the social changes that have been happening in our society over the past couple of decades or few decades. The failure of the progressive side of the House to talk about and include men is one of the reasons why Donald Trump was just reelected. In fact, it's one of the animating features of the rise of right-wing populism, both in the United States and in parts of Europe. An animating feature of that is men, not just white people, but men who are feeling dislocated. They're feeling pushed off center stage. Especially white men who have had cultural centrality for forever, really, and certainly in the West, are feeling threats to that centrality, both in the family and in the larger society. And if we don't speak to those concerns and those, in some cases, resentments, and give them a better story, a way to think about themselves as part of the positive changes that are happening, then you're going to see them moving to the right, which is what we've seen. Now, when women and people of color and LGBTQ folks and others from marginalized or subordinated groups assert their needs and their interests, they're often derided as playing identity politics. But when white men, and we talk about white men's needs and interests, somehow that's not identity politics. I mean, and I think that's something we have to look at, which is the ways in which the dominant culture sort of prevents itself from being accountable by pretending or by presuming that when white men assert their interests, those aren't just identity interests, those are broader concerns about things like the economy or immigration or issues. But when people of color or women or LGBTQ folks assert their needs, somehow that's identity politics. I think we have to call that out in a sense and say that white male identity politics is a central feature of American politics. And by the way, Donald Trump did not, discover this, or this is not a recent development. The Republican Party has been playing white male identity politics for the past 50 years. I made a film about this. It's called The Man Card, 50 years of gender power and the American presidency. And it goes all the way back to Nixon and looks at the ways in which the Republican Party has been able to reach out to men and present themselves as the party that represents the interests of men, not just white men in the sort of post-civil rights era, but as men in an era of feminist ascendance and LGBTQ challenges to white male heteronormative centrality. So I think part of the issue here is conceptual. We have to think beyond the simple categories and look more broadly. And by the way, Donald Trump in the 2016 campaign said that Hillary Clinton was playing the woman card when he was in fact playing the man card. And from the moment Donald Trump appeared on the stage, he has been presenting himself as the man's candidate and MAGA as a men's movement. And we need to say that out loud.
Thanks so much, Jackson, for your opening statement. And now I want to turn to you, Thomas. You disagree. You believe identity politics cannot help Democrats engage men. Here's your chance to tell us why you're taking that side.
Hi, thank you. And thanks, Jackson. I think it's really a very valuable conversation to have someone who's a specialist and an expert on masculinity like Jackson in conversation with someone like me who is a generalist and approaches this issue of men the way I would approach a debate about any other identity group, whether we're talking about women or blacks or Latinos or whites or green people. I think the fundamental point is that Democrats should be trying to do as little identity politics as possible. I want to recall almost 2 decades ago, the beginning of the Obama era, and the kind of extraordinary mandate that Barack Obama came into office with, which was to unite the country and lead us into a kind of post-racial, but also really post-identitarian politics of unity. If you look at the Gallup polls of that time, it wasn't just that he energized Democrats, it was that he actually captivated the nation as a whole to try to think about what our better self could be. 2/3 of McCain voters back then were happy that Obama won and were optimistic about what he could do. We can't get into all of the reasons why the post-racial, post-identity future didn't materialize, but suffice to say, Hillary Clinton's campaign doubled down on a kind of fragmented politics of identity, and Trump swept into the nomination and then the presidency in 2016 on a white identity politics of grievance. We should always recall that identity politics is a fickle weapon that can be picked up and used by anyone. The first real politics of identity in American history was the Ku Klux Klan. So it's worth remembering that the main victories of the left and of Democrats have been the civil rights movement and the movement for gay marriage. And these were movements that sought to extend human flourishing and equality to as many people as possible, as opposed to identifying groups that were marginalized and then prioritizing their specific grievance. Furthermore, the Democrats' focus on identity and victimization has actually created space for demagogues to paint politics as zero-sum. If women make progress, that's at the expense of men. If blacks make progress, it comes at the cost of white people. We need to fully return to a universal politics of shared values and outrage over injustice, regardless of which identity group it attaches to. For example, when George Floyd died, that should not necessarily excite our imagination any more than when Tony Timpa was killed in almost identical circumstances and we didn't think about it at all. Simply adding a seat to the table of victimization for men will not address the deeper societal fractures or even win sufficient numbers of men back from the nihilism and cynicism that Trump has shown them. When Kamala Harris got up and talked about having a Glock and trying to kind of mimic the masculine values that the right espoused, it did not actually work to attract men. The core strength of liberalism is its universal values that benefit everyone. We need to abandon divisive identity politics. The promise glimpsed during the Obama era can still be realized if we return to a politics that maximizes flourishing for all, irrespective of the abstract labels we attach to them.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Very, very briefly, I just want to see if there's common ground on one issue. And again, this is not to be asking you to take sides necessarily. And I'm certainly not. I'm just sharing the impression that's out there, and I referenced the work of Richard Reeves, that American men are having, as a group, are having a unique set of challenges, especially compared to their role in their position in society in the past. That their health is challenged, that women are outliving men by an even wider margin in terms of lifespan than before, that men are falling behind in education, that men are falling behind in terms of integration into successful family life, a perception that American men are having a tough time, period. And I want to ask you, Thomas, do you disagree with that assessment? Again, not of what should be done, not of what the politics should be, what the party should do, but just, do we have a baseline agreement that American men are going through a challenging time?
In a qualified way, yeah, sure, that makes sense. Men are fully half of the human population, though, so I have a kind of instinctive hesitancy to talk broadly about what 50% of humans are going through, even 50% of Americans. Which men are we talking about? Are we talking about college-educated men? Are we talking about upper-class men? Are we talking about poor men? Well, I mean, we need to get much more specific and granular, I believe, before we can have a productive conversation.
I hear you in that. And again, just as briefly to you, Jackson, do you think that this is a uniquely difficult time for American men?
Well, I think that men have issues. I take Thomas's point. I 100% agree that you have to talk about men not as a monolith, but within subcategories. But can I just also say, John, it relates to an earlier point that Thomas had made.
Jackson, if you don't mind, I just wanted to get that point across. So what I'm hearing from both of you is that men are not a monolith. That yes, certainly men are having difficulties and challenges. Whether that's unique to men or not is open for debate, but that's not specifically what we're debating. We'll be debating what the solution should be. And the question we're taking on, could identity politics help the Democrats engage men? Our two debaters, Jackson Katz and Thomas Chatterton Williams, are taking opposite positions on that. And when we heard in their opening statement, Jackson making the point that he's actually arguing that Donald Trump did play with an identity politics around men, and that was to the disadvantage of the Democratic Party. He's saying that it's time for the Democrats to recognize that men do represent a group that have their own issues that need to be addressed, that their sense of identity has been overlooked by, I would say, by the general political discourse on the left, that they're not included when other groups are cited for being members of groups that are disadvantaged. He says that men have their own needs, especially in a time when they're living through a threat to the centrality that they held in the culture traditionally. And he's also arguing overall for a destigmatization of the very term identity politics, that it's a way to dismiss a certain approach to reaching out to political groups, and he thinks it's time to embrace that. I'm hearing Thomas Chatterton Williams say that as a general rule, he just thinks that the notion of playing to identity groups itself is not something that's going to advance the cause of liberalism in our culture, that universal values are the core strength, and the recognition of universality is the core strength of liberalism, and that identity politics has a history of sometimes really taking directions that people come to regret in the long term. So I want to dig back into your opening statement, Jackson, where you're making the case that the party does need to say, when it lists women, LGBTQ, Black Americans, Latino Americans, and men, to identify, to recognize their identity and their needs. What would that look like? What would be the appeal, as you see it, to men that the Democratic Party would make? What would they start to talk about?
I mean, I think this is just really pretty basic, just talking about their lives and reaching out to them and going into, traditional areas of where men reside, if you will, and talking to them. And it's not just listening, it's also engaging in a dialogue. I do want to, building on something that Thomas had said earlier, I want to dissociate myself from any sense that I'm saying that men are victims or a new victim category is men. I'm not about that at all. And I do think it's important, however, to make distinctions, especially class distinctions. For example, when we talk about the white male vote in the 2024 election, according to exit polls, and I know exit polls are a bit of a fluid target, but exit polls show that among college-educated white men, Trump beat Biden by 50 to 47, which is only 3 points, but by the way, which is way closer than the historic average in the last several election cycle, last several decades, with the exception of 2020. In other words, the college white male vote is very close, but the high school educated white male vote, Trump beat Harris by 40 points. And what the Republicans have been doing for decades is running the table with the white high school educated male vote in rural areas and suburban and even urban areas in huge and overwhelming numbers. In part, not because of policy, not because of the Democratic Party's policy versus the Republicans' party policy, but because the narrative in the popular political discourse and the ways that the Republicans reach out to white men in those areas has been much more successful. Can I say Steve Bannon, who's one of the obviously architects of Trumpism, if you will, and one of the global strategists on the far right for the rise of populism in recent years. Steve Bannon says that they're in a full-on battle for a narrative. Everything is narrative. So I would focus on story and narrative and talking to these men and being able to show them how progressive policies will benefit them as men, and it'll benefit them in helping to do what they think they need to do to fulfill their roles as they see them as men, which is protector and provider. If they can do that, if the Democrats can tell that story, then they'll have many more of those men as allies and not antagonists.
All right, you said a lot in there, and what I want to take back to Thomas, and I want to bring a bunch of it back to Thomas, but the first part I want to take to Thomas is just the recognition that you're saying we should all have, Jackson, that the Republican Party and Donald Trump have actually practiced an identity politics focused on men, and that just as a matter of balancing the scale, Thomas, the Democratic Party should be doing the same, going after the same group in order to counteract the identity politics of the right. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I think, of course, the identity politics is used on both the left and the right. It's not simply a problem that Democrats have, or it's not simply a tactic Democrats utilize. But I don't think that the key is for Democrats to offer a weak simulacrum of Republican overtures to masculine values. I just don't think it's very authentically convincing when Kamala Harris says if you come in her house, she's going to shoot you with her Glock. I think Democrats need to actually oppose Republican identity politics and the cynicism that can often entail the exploitation of uninformed, uneducated voters. They can oppose that with broad policies that actually improve the lives of the working class. I think Bernie Sanders showed that many of his voters did actually end up going towards Trump when they didn't have a viable alternative on the identity left. So when you started, John, by asking, can we add, men to the chorus of narratives we already have for LGBTQ people, women, minorities, and by the time you add men in, it sounds to me like we're talking to everybody. So why not have a universal narrative that everybody can buy into that benefits everybody?
This is exactly the question I'd like to take to you, Jackson. Why not make it for everybody? And as I think as Thomas was pointing out, once you add men in, it kind of becomes everybody.
Again, I think there's this. We have to thread the needle, I think, a little better here. I don't mean just us in this conversation, but in the larger political conversation. Is that I think that I'm saying that we need to include men in a positive story. If we just use gender neutral terms and universalist themes without specifically saying we see men, we see white working class men, blue collar men, Black, Latino, Asian, et cetera, struggling. We see that there's suicide and loneliness epidemic and mental health challenges and opioid addiction that are disproportionately affecting these communities. That doesn't mean that we're playing identity politics. We're just being responsive to the needs of a group of people, and we're articulating that. And I think a big part of what I think men need, including young men, is they need to be seen and heard, and they need to feel like the progressives care about them. Can I say, if you pay attention to right-wing media, which I have for almost 40 years, maybe it's an obsession, but I've been paying very close attention to right-wing talk radio and right-wing social theory and media for a long time. It's taken as an article of faith and just common sense that the Democrats and the left of center hates men, in particular white men. That they don't. It's not even a debatable point. They just assume it. White men are hated, and I think that's wrong. I understand why they think that, but I think it's wrong, and I think there's a way to counteract that by saying, wait a second, progressive politics, the kind of policies even that Joe Biden was successful at pushing legislation and pushing through is going to dramatically benefit men, including white men and blue collar men more generally. And can I also say feminism is not anti-male. That's another shibboleth on the right that is constantly repeated as if it's like an obvious point, and it's not true. Feminism is actually one of the best things that's ever happened to men. But you wouldn't know that if you listen to Fox or talk radio. You'd hear the exact opposite, that feminists hate men. Meanwhile, the men's health movement, which is a really important way of thinking about men's emotional, physical, sexual, and mental health, that is connected to their gendered sort of being. And the men's health movement is a small movement, but it's growing, is a direct outgrowth of the feminist-led women's health movement, which gave us the intellectual architecture and cultural space to talk about the ways in which gender affected women's health and the healthcare delivery system. So if we're going to talk about a positive conversation about men's health, which we should talk about in a general sense, let's credit that to feminism, which is not anti-male. It's actually in that sense pro-male. That's the kind of narrative that we don't hear enough of.
Yeah, go for it, Thomas.
Can I jump in and just say that where I think I really agree with Jackson and where there's a lot of overlap is that I think Democrats could make huge gains by simply ceasing to stigmatize men in general, and specifically straight white men as a category, and return to a kind of neutrality, which is again in line with my idea that universal values and principles actually benefit everybody the most. I think that they've erred too far in the direction of stigmatizing and making men feel that they don't matter in this coalition. In fact, everybody is entitled to self-esteem and a sense of worthiness, except for this one group who happen to be numerically
and
quite
Thomas, you're saying that
significant.
That is because of identity politics as it's been practiced?
Yes, exactly. That's an outgrowth of identity politics.
Can I respond? Thank you, Thomas. I know I appreciate that there's more points of overlap here than there is,
Absolutely.
100% divergence. Okay, but I would say one of the challenges the Democratic Party has had since the early 1970s, and it continues to this day, is trying to, on the one hand, represent the interests of the ascendant classes, if you will, of women in a feminist era, of LGBTQ folks, of people of color, and at the same time hold on to the white, if you will, the white working class, which is one of the constitutive parts of the New Deal coalition, and trying to sort of do both at the same time has been the biggest uphill challenge, I think, for the Democratic Party, and they failed at it pretty badly. And I think the reason why the politics of the country have moved to the right over the last several decades, and they have, the Overton window has definitely moved to the right, is because the Democrats lose the white male vote so badly in election after election. And if we don't figure out a better way to tell this story about that you can do both at the same time, in other words, you can lift up everybody at the same time, but we have to be specific about including men and white men in that lifting up piece, not just the groups that have historically been marginalized. If we don't do that, then we get what we get.
How explicitly, Jackson, are you suggesting that the party appeal to white men? I mean, they name women, they name blacks, they name Latinos. Do they want to be saying, we're here for white men also?
Well, again, I also am extremely, I want to raise an extremely cautionary flag that Thomas has already raised, that white male identity politics can be played by the right in ways that are completely racist and pernicious and negative. So I don't think we have to fully embrace some identitarian politics on the left. That's not what I would say. I would say that creating inclusive narratives and stories and going into those spaces and talking to these men and having, that's why I think that's really great when you have progressives and liberals and Democratic Party people going on Fox, going into red states. I work in red states all over the country. I'm constantly giving talks and trainings in very conservative areas. I work with the military. I work in the sports culture. In other words, I'm not in some cloistered, liberal bubble. I'm out in the world all the time working with people across these boundaries. And I think that people can be responsive, but I think showing up is a critical piece of the package here. And by the way, to Thomas's point, you've mentioned it a couple times. The cosplaying of, I have a Glock, and if you come into my house, you're going to get shot. I think when Democrats start engaging in this kind of sort of almost like petty, theatrics, it almost always backfires because it's so transparent. So I think it has to be much more organic, and that's why Bernie Sanders, to use an example that you already referenced, the Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump voters, those of us who are concerned with policy think, what are you kidding? If you supported Bernie Sanders, how can you then support Donald Trump? Because it wasn't about policy. It was because they responded to Bernie Sanders' energy and anger and authenticity, not to his policy positions, which align much more closely with the Democrats than anything you could imagine that Donald Trump would represent.
Thomas, Jackson has made it clear that he's not arguing for a labeling of men as victims. He's not proposing a kind of a victimization package, but he did say that he feels that men are experiencing, your phrase in your opening was a threat to their centrality in the culture, by which I think you mean, Jackson, that over time, men had the best paying jobs. Men were, the leaders in academic life, places where they no longer have those because of changes in society. And that's a reality that needs to be, I think you're saying, spoken to and addressed. And I want to take that to you, Thomas. What do you think about addressing that issue head on as a part of the message that would come from the Democratic Party and from the left?
Jackson has made several points, or several times he's stated the importance and necessity of framing narratives, which I certainly agree with. And I think that Democrats really need to understand how to create a narrative that's inspiring and persuasive to men across ethnicities, because we've seen black men and Latino men, especially working class, have some of the same kind of proclivities as white men do. They need to craft a narrative that shows that, in fact, human flourishing is not a zero-sum game. It is not a limited pie that when women get a larger slice, you necessarily give up your slice. I think we need to show how everybody can flourish together by creating, a culture of opportunity. And that's why I think once and for all, we need to abandon this kind of pandering. My friend Mark Lilla brilliantly wrote after Hillary Clinton got defeated in 2016 an op-ed in the New York Times that went viral. And one of the key points in there was that he said, I just looked at the DNC website, and they had 17 different platforms depending on your identity group. If you were a Latina, you click here. If you're LGBTQ, click here to see our platform. The RNC had one platform. It was what they were going to do. It might have been something you completely disagree with, but they were clear that this is what we intend to do regardless of what your identity group, your abstract identity group is. And I think Democrats need to get back to that. The enthusiasm that Obama carried in 2008 has never been captured in the kind of post-Obama Democrat leaning into identitarianism politics that we've been subjected to ever since.
So, Jackson, Thomas is suggesting that the Democrats should not only not single out men, but they should just stop singling out people grouped by essential characteristics. What's your take on that?
Again, I think that's more aspirational and almost utopian than in very practical terms. There are interests that people have based on their social position, their subject position, whether women, like are we going to pretend, for example, that abortion rights are not women's rights? Like that there's somehow...
May I interject?
Yeah.
That doesn't work. Appealing to women around the issue of abortion actually backfired, and Kamala Harris lost ground with women. Trump gained ground on 2020 with women when that was front and center on the agenda.
Fine. I mean, that's a practical political reality that we're trying to figure out. Like, in other words, how did abortion? How did they miscalculate how important abortion would be for millions and millions of women voters who Trump figured out a sort of sweet sauce where he could figure out a way to narrate his own position in a way that they can justify being pro-choice and voting for Donald Trump. I mean, it's complicated when you get into the weeds, but I'm just saying there's no doubt that there are specific interests that people have based on their social position that I don't want to negate. Like, I work on men's violence against women, for example. Are we going to say all people need to engage with the subject of sexual assault and domestic violence and everybody got to work together? Or are we going to say we need more men to start speaking out about men's violence against women because women have been carrying the burden on that subject forever, and there have been very few men who've had the courage and the strength to stand with those women? Not just people standing together, but men standing up and saying, I'm against that abusive behavior, and I'm going to challenge other men who are engaging in it. By the way, similar...
And so you're saying they're speaking as men, not
Yes, as men, not as people. And I would say that it's important for people who are in groups that have relative historic advantage. Again, we can pose a universalist ideal, but there are people who have disproportionate advantage. And, white men are historically advantaged in the West. I mean, again, there are subsets of white men. There are gay men, there are straight men, there are, what do you call it?
There are poor men.
There are poor men, there are rich men. So it's impossible to posit one, homogenous group of even white men. I appreciate that. That's why we have to get a little more specific. Maybe the Republicans don't have to for their own purposes. We do.
One thing we haven't gotten to, and it's a complicated topic, is concept of masculinity. And people define it different ways. People aspire to it in different ways. But Thomas, how does the notion of masculinity, in your view, fit into this conversation about what the politics around men in politics should be?
That's a great question. And in fact, I actually want to respond maybe with an answer that remains interrogative. What are men's interests? What are masculine values? American society is so dynamic and complicated a quarter of the way into the 21st century. I don't know that we can define those in a way that works with a population that's 335 million. I mean, educated men who have, jobs in the symbolic economy, as Musa al-Garbi would dub it, or as a sociologist would dub it, are so divergent from what is kind of the caricature of masculine values at the GOP, the RNC convention, with Hulk Hogan tearing his shirt. I don't know how we put those people all together under one label. Do you know what I mean? And women, in the workplace who are pulling down really incredible salaries and large numbers, what is within, what is the women's interest here? What is the black interest? I guess I come at this Jackson is an expert on masculinity, but I come at this, with a deep skepticism that we can ever articulate what any group's values or interests are. When you say that, we should defund the police or, look into, limiting police interactions because that's in the interest of black people, you get tons of black people in poor communities screaming, saying, stop doing this. I'm the one living with the violence. Put the police back. So which is it? Is it soft or hard on crime that helps black people and is in the interest of that community?
So back to you, Jackson, on the masculinity question. I mean, what should the party be thinking about when it's representing the interests of men? Is it also working at defining what it means by masculinity and what it means to be a man?
Well, again, I think I appreciate the question and the opportunity to say that even the term masculinity is limiting. I would use a more sociological term, which is masculinities, TIES, which suggests that masculinity is not a singular construct, but there's a range of different masculinities that are vying with each other, and also competing with each other, but also then in a patriarchal culture, those masculinities are, generally speaking, in a positive position or a powerful position vis-a-vis women. Okay, so that's important to acknowledge. So I think there's a broader conversation about masculinity. I don't know if there's such a thing that I would argue, Thomas, that we need to instill, sort of masculine values. I wouldn't put it that way. I would say that American culture is very much a tension. This is a broad way of thinking about American culture, is a broad tension between rugged individualist ideas, which is very masculine, the idea that you can make it on your own, independent. A real man is somebody who's independent, not interdependent, but independent, and can kind of do it on his own, like the Marlboro Man, right? Out in nature, and no one else is really got to be part of the package. It's not relational. It's very much individualistic. Versus community, the connection and community and the sense of being connected and interdependent, which is in a binary terms is coded as very feminine. And so I think one of the tensions in American life is between the individual versus the community, which is, in binary gender terms, is masculine and feminine. And I do think there's an awful lot of men who are very caring and very relational and want to be involved in the lives of their children, for example, in ways that historically previous generations of men weren't. There's all these positive changes. By the way, feminism is what has propelled those changes in men's lives and getting men more in touch with their relational selves and emotional and relational lives with their children and with others. So I mean, there's a broader conversation that many of us have been having over the years about how to transform this notion of, quote, masculinity in ways that are more life-affirming for men and
Jackson,
not just caricatured.
One thing we saw that the Republicans do was play to us, as Thomas suggested, play to a certain notion of masculinity. And there's this whole culture now of podcasts that young men are listening to, that Donald Trump, certainly went and visited and did interviews, and that Kamala Harris didn't. She's been criticized a little bit for perhaps making the wrong choice. But where does, in terms of the political game that's to be played in representing men, what does the Democratic Party do with that culture of podcasts, the kind of conversations they have, and also, the recognition of the kind of masculinity that they claim to be about?
Well, again, thank you for asking me. The Democratic Party had, $1.5 billion, and they spent very tiny amount of money. The Republicans outspent the Democrats in outreach to young men by something like 10-1. We need to go into the Democrats, progressives, liberals need to go into these spaces. They need to go on these shows. They need to create their own shows. They need to create a whole media sort of infrastructure. A lot of people are talking about this because young men are not reading, forgive me, Thomas, think pieces in the Atlantic. I read them, and John reads them, and maybe a lot of people in the audience read them, but young men are not reading think pieces, and they're not going to seminars. They're listening to Theo Vaughn interviewing Donald Trump, or they're listening to Joe Rogan interview an astrophysicist one day and some political figure on the next day, and they're watching social media. And by the way, the Trump campaign knows this, and what they did, for example, Donald Trump would go to UFC fights, and he would show up at the fight, knowing, by the way, it's a great photo op. You have thousands of cheering men, mostly men, and disproportionately Black and Latino in those spaces. And Donald Trump would walk in, everybody would be cheering. Sometimes a fighter, literally in the ring, would, in the square, would say, "Donald Trump is in the house," and everybody would cheer. And that would go on social media and get millions and millions of views, which then reinforced the idea that he's the man's candidate. We love him. He loves us. And then those people, the Democrats, don't even have the time, give us the time of day. So I would say, John, we need to go into those spaces and create our own spaces and talk to those men on their terms.
But Bernie Sanders went on Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan endorsed him. I mean, Democrats have already been in those spaces and, can reach with a universal message. They don't have to pander. Bernie Sanders was Joe Rogan's candidate before he flipped to Trump.
I'm sorry, that was a one-off. Joe Rogan platforms right-wing voices and anti-feminist voices almost every day. He has once occasionally he'll have a Bernie Sanders on or he'll have a Cornel West on, and he'll agree with them, and then he'll have a series of right-wing voices the next several days and agree with them as well. So I think it's overstated that he was like somehow a progressive who was like a really a Bernie supporter. I'll say this for your air. Joe Rogan has never had, as far as I know, a man on who's arguing a pro-feminist or a gender equality position, not once, ever, in all the thousands of shows that he's done. In other words, his audience, which is disproportionately men and young men, have never even heard men articulate that you can be a strong man, a powerful man, and support gender justice and racial justice and feminism. They've never even heard this on the Joe Rogan show. So I think Joe Rogan is reachable on some level. I think he seems like a reasonable guy, but he hasn't given anything like the platform like you're doing, John, and this program to this kind of conversation.
Thomas, you want to respond to that?
Sure. Well, I would just say when the candidate was talking about issues that didn't specify identities, as Sanders was, Joe Rogan invited him on. And if he, in fact, is hostile to identity politics overtures, I don't see how doubling down on those is going to get you to reach his audience on his platform.
The question we're taking on here is, could identity politics help Democrats engage men? I'm John Donvan, and our debaters are Jackson Katz and Thomas Chatterton Williams. We've been talking about this for quite a while now, got to some interesting places, but we always get to more interesting places when we bring in other voices to the conversation. So I want to first welcome Cecilia D'Anastasio. Cecilia is an award-winning journalist with Bloomberg News, where she reports on the video game industry and digital culture. Cecilia, welcome to Open to Debate, and please come in with your question.
Thank you for having me. Great conversation so far. I want to start with the video game question. So over the last decade, we've seen gaming companies producing games that don't center the type of people, the demographic that games have been marketed to for a long time, upper middle class men. And there's been some serious backlash to that from that demographic of gamers, accusing video game companies of eroding or even taking away their culture. This is a question for Jackson. We've seen the same dynamics in politics recently around the DEI backlash. How could the Democratic Party convince young men that centering other perspectives is additive and not destructive?
That's a great question, and I know
that's a really great question.
I know that I can't do it full justice, but I would say one of the ways that I would reframe the narrative about that set of issues is that it takes more strength on the part of men and young men to lift up others than it is to dominate others. In other words, being inclusive is actually a quality that you should aspire to. It's not softness, it's not weakness, it's actually strength. And men who are confident would not be threatened by, for example, women's aspirations. White people who are confident aren't going to be threatened by people of color who are aspiring to be treated as full citizens. Heterosexual people who are confident and self-secure people aren't threatened by others' aspirations to be treated as whole human beings. So I would frame it as not a sign of weakness and softness, if you will, on the part of men to incorporate these, new groups of people who want to come into those spaces, but it's a sign of strength. And some people might say, well, why do you have to use that kind of terminology? I think because I'm very practical. I think we need to use that kind of terminology because it's positive and aspirational. And by the way, we're deep into this conversation, and the word has not even been mentioned. Toxic masculinity. I never even used the term toxic masculinity in my work, in my writing. I think it's a problematic term because even though I know what it means, and a lot of other people know what it means, I think if the goal is to have an open and honest conversation with men and young men, it pushes the wrong buttons. Also, can I also say that Gamergate in 2014 was an incredible moment where men in the gaming industry, not the industry itself, but the gamers were fighting back against feminist aspirations to, critique the incredible misogyny of the gaming industry. And Steve Bannon figured out, this is one of his early insights, he could weaponize the anger that he saw and the resentment among young men in Gamergate for political ends towards right-wing populist ends and Trump's ascension. So it's clearly you bring an important point into the conversation, that the gaming culture, if you will, is a male-dominated space, that there's been a real sort of hunkering down on the part of some men at diversifying that space, just like there is in some workplaces.
Thomas, you want to respond to either the question or to Jackson's response to the question?
Well, I don't have strong views on video gaming or that specifically, but I do think that, some of the frustration around, we can say, DEI or what's happened in movies, in Hollywood, and entertainment, and I guess video games as well, is what feels like an inauthentic need to just take anything and make the character into XYZ category, whether it's a remake of a film or whether it's a Marvel comic superhero. There's something that feels false, and I think the superlative of that movement in the culture is like Google Gemini. When you ask them to draw a picture of the founding fathers, it's like just African American men and disabled women. This is like the extreme of the tendency to just diversify the culture for its own sake. I think inclusiveness and the principle and the value of a thriving multi-ethnic culture that excludes no one can be pursued without the kind of contrivance of identity fetishization for its own appeal.
Cecilia, I want to thank you very much for your question. I just also want to point out to our audience that I mentioned Cecilia is an award-winning journalist. Her award-winning work actually has focused on the awards are for work she did focusing on misogyny in the gaming culture and in Silicon Valley, and I recommend that to you. Cecilia, thanks so much for joining us. Next up, we have a question from Amanda Clayton. Amanda is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at UC Berkeley. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us on the program, and please come on in with your question.
Great. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this conversation. I want to agree with some of the speakers, and I think that the Republican Party is activating white male grievance and a certain type of masculinity. So wishing that we could go back to 2008 seems like a non-starter. As does thinking that Democrats can appeal to conservative men with these sorts of progressive overtures, trying to explain to them that feminism isn't zero-sum. I just don't think that's going to work. So given that we're in this place where identity politics is being activated by the right, I think the question really is, how should Democrats respond? And personally, I think it's about embracing the working class roots of the Democratic Party. That is an authentic way that the party can respond. And I think that's what Joe Biden did so well in 2020. That's what Bernie Sanders has been able to do so well. And so this leads me to my question, though, is I don't know whether or not this messaging can really be done by people on the left that don't themselves come from these roots and aren't themselves white men. So where does that leave the Democratic Party if they also want to, at the same time, embrace diversity in their leadership?
Amanda, who would you like to take that question first?
I would first, let's say, to Jackson.
Okay, thanks, Jackson, if you could take that.
Sure. Well, again, it's a great question and framing. I mean, and I'm in support of what you're saying. I mean, there's the great book Rust Belt Union, Rust Belt Union Blues, which talks about the decline of the union movement in Western Pennsylvania, and how what used to be connecting working class, including white working class men, was not just the actual workplace, but all the other, the union halls and the bowling leagues and all the ways in which the men were connecting through unions, and then a class consciousness was being formed, and of course those unions were supporting mostly the Democrats, because the Democrats are more pro-union, obviously, than the Republicans. But because with the decline of unionism, now these men are connecting through gun clubs. This is with the argument of Rust Belt Union Blues. And gun clubs, which are tend to be more right-wing, and Fox News is playing in the gun club, but it's meeting a need of these people for connection. So I think the decline of unions, and especially manufacturing unions and sort of blue-collar trade unions, which were dominated by white men to the exclusion of women and people of color. And I understand that that's one of the tensions in the union movement over the years. But the decline of unionism was one of the reasons why there's been a sort of a shift to the right among the white working class, because they didn't have a way to connect with each other, and they didn't have the inputs, the progressive inputs, and the class consciousness that are shaped by those kind of associations. But I would say, yes, we need to have a very much a class focus. And I think obviously the Democratic Party needs to be much better at articulating a progressive working class politics. But I do think there are gender aspects of that have to be acknowledged, just like Thomas and I were talking about earlier.
Thomas, if you can take on the same question, I'm also curious whether you think an appeal to the working class would itself be a form of identity politics or not.
Well, I mean, we can say that, there are many facets of identity that one can, emphasize or de-emphasize. And I think that actually broad-based class coalitions, which cut across, immutable characteristics, is a healthier kind of identity politics, as it were, to pursue if you have to. Obviously, you have to, politics is coalitional. So I think something rooted in class can be quite effective. I think Bernie Sanders demonstrated twice the appeal of that. And, I think that Donald Trump has even to an extent demonstrated the appeal of that this time. I don't fully concede the point that we cannot return to a kind of optimistic, transcendent politics of unity that can even be led by a non-white candidate such as we saw in 2008. I think the country, and in fact the globe, I live half the year in France, and it cannot be overstated. The entire world was captivated by the ascendance of Barack Obama. It gave us a glimpse into something that we wanted to see in our own politics, and it gave Europeans a glimpse of what they wanted to see. It was really a moment when people wanted to achieve the multi-ethnic societies that we all are already living in. So I think we can recapture that. I think it has to be done authentically, and it can't be pandering.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for your question. Great question. Got us to a really interesting place. Now we're going to hear a question from Mike Nellis. Mike Nellis is former senior advisor to Kamala Harris and founder of Authentic, which is a digital fundraising and advertising agency for Democratic candidates and social impact causes. Mike was not able to join us live, but he sent in a question ahead of time, and that's what we're going to hear and watch now.
Democrats have embraced identity politics over the last decade, but have been very hesitant to organize specifically with white men. That's part of the reason that they've moved in the opposite direction. If Democrats are going to continue to do this, if that's the best strategic choice for the party, how do they get beyond being too afraid to organize with white men, rural voters, and even to a certain degree, white women? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question, Mike. I'm going to take that first to you, Jackson. We touched on it just a little bit before, which is, how do you put the word white into the list of groups that you're saying you're up there to support?
It's tread lightly on that because of the history of organizing white men in a backlash sort of victimization way, which I'm totally want to dissociate myself from. Mm-hmm. But I think it's going into those spaces. It's having difficult conversations and saying things and having dialogue. And to Amanda's earlier point, it's related. She was saying, how did the Democratic Party do this? Get some voices that will be able to reach those, you say, blue-collar white male voters. If you're trying to diversify the party and lift up voices of people who have been excluded, I think we have to do both. We have to do both. We have to have blue-collar. We have to have trusted messengers. If this is a basic concept in advertising and public health. If you want to send out a message, you have to have trusted messengers, people who can identify with, who you can identify with. And I don't want to overly caricature this because people can hear messages from different people on different subject positions and races and ethnicities and genders and sexual orientations, but they also want to connect with people that they can connect with. And so, getting blue-collar men out into the blue-collar neighborhoods and getting blue-collar candidates running for office in, white rural areas. I mean, these are all part of party building over years and decades. It's not going to happen overnight, but I do think it's important that we have those voices and that the Democratic Party lifts up those voices and doesn't see that by giving voice to some of the concerns of men and white men, that you're somehow excluding or saying that it's not important to lift up the voices of others who have been historically marginalized as well.
Thomas?
I mean, I think the results speak for themselves of what White Dudes for Harris was able to accomplish. I think that people on the left, liberals, Democrats specifically, anyone of goodwill in a society such as ours should be leery at least of a politics that activates a racialized sense of identity within white people and white men specifically. I want to reiterate the first identity politics movement in America was the Ku Klux Klan. It was a successful movement that mobilized white identity. I think that the future belongs to the movement that understands how to activate the features that unite us across ethnicity and de-emphasizes all immutable characteristics that divide us and that cannot be transcended.
Thank you very much. And again, I want to thank Mike for bringing in that question. I now want to go on to our last questioner, and that is Danielle Kurtzleben. Danielle is a political correspondent on NPR's Washington desk. Danielle, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for listening to the conversation so far. I've been very interested to see what kind of question you would come up with, so please come in and do that.
Oh, this has been, look, I have 9 questions, but I'll just give you one. This year, the Democratic Party understandably talked a lot about women because Dobbs. And another thing, and I want to bring in another thing we really haven't mentioned much yet in all this talk of Bernie and Obama, which is that the Democratic Party has now had 2 women at the top of the ticket since those guys. So I think in the popular imagination for a lot of voters, the Democratic Party is quite frankly the feminine party, the more feminine of the 2 parties. So I'm wondering, to what degree do you two feel that that precludes a certain chunk of men from coming over to the Democratic Party? I guess I'm wondering, is there a sort of male flight from the Democrats as it becomes the party of girls? And I say that flippantly, of course. And this is a question for both of you, because on the one hand, Jackson, this would put into question the whole idea of whether male identity politics could work. But also, Thomas, because you've held up Bernie and Obama as these unifying examples, but since those 2 guys, things have changed so drastically. There have been women candidates, and Dobbs has changed the equation.
Thomas, why don't you go into that one first, please?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. It's actually it's quite thoughtful, and I think it's an important one to answer and to think through. But, you know, Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by over 3 million votes by more than he beat Kamala Harris by. So I don't think that we are not a country that's prepared to vote for a qualified and charismatic female candidate. I think that Kamala Harris had specific problems as a candidate, that some of which were outside of her control, that were not about her gender. They were about being attached to Joe Biden, who became one of the most unpopular presidents in modern American history, as well as just the kind of bias against incumbents worldwide that we've been seeing. So I actually do think that the country could easily elect a female candidate. I think it's quite possible that the first female president might be conservative, as often is the case. But I really think that the fact that women broke for Trump over their 2020 numbers with abortion so front and center should give us all pause about thinking that people vote first and foremost based on their gender, or ethnicity, or et cetera.
Jackson, to you, please.
Well, yeah, thanks for the question, Danielle. I think, we have to acknowledge that Trump has been playing, and the Republicans have been playing identity politics successfully for decades. And that if we don't figure out how to, on the progressive side, how to do not what they're doing, not the sort of funhouse mirror other side of what Trump is doing, but create narratives that would bring more men in. We're going to be increasingly polarized in the way that Danielle's question suggests. I would say we don't have to get a massive number of men to join, including white men, to step back over from the sort of the MAGA universe and into some sort of pro-feminist Democratic Party. We just need a small percentage. I mean, I always talk about 5 to 10%, even less than that would be a tipping point if we could pull back a certain number of men who are not drawn into the narrative that a real man is a Republican. A lot of men see that as silly, and if we could draw some of those men back in, including independents, then the Democrats would have enough votes to win elections and then be able to promote legislation that affects everybody in the positive way, in the universalist way that Thomas is talking about. So I don't think we have to, I always say, I'm not unrealistic. I'm not saying we need to go to a MAGA rally and try to recruit men into the Democratic Party, into progressive politics. But I think there's enough men who are sort of not fully Trumpers, but who end up voting for Trump, that we can create a narrative that will bring them back into the progressive side of the House.
Danielle, thank you so much for your question. Really appreciate it. I also want to thank everybody else who came in with questions. Cecilia, Amanda, and Mike, they really got us to some interesting places. But now it is time to bring this all home with our closing round. And our closing round, each of our two debaters gets one more chance to make their argument for why they're taking sides they are on our question, which once again is, could identity politics help the Democrats engage men? Jackson, for your closing statement, you are up first.
Thanks, John. And again, thank you, Thomas, for this discussion and debate. I've enjoyed it, and I hope it's useful. I just want to say there's for people who are interested in this kind of conversation that we're having, and especially the masculinities piece, in other words, thinking about men and men's lives and the politics of masculinity, there's been an entire literature. There's been an explosion of writing and research, and both journalistic and academic, over the past 30 years that gives us great insight into the ways in which men have or have not adjusted to the changes that have been promulgated by feminism and by the civil rights movement before it, and by the various movements for social justice and social change over the past couple of generations. So if you're interested and you're a person who cares about this stuff, please know that we're not just beginning the conversation. I do have to say in a very optimistic way that the results of this last election are making a lot of people pay more attention to the narrative that we're using about men, and because the disaster of right wing, the rise of the right in Europe and the United States, and what's coming, is now making people realize, wait a second, we need to do better. And I think this is one of the ways to do it, is to access stuff that's already been thought about and written about and struggled with. And finally, I want to say, there's an awful lot of pressure on men, including young men. And I'm part of the Young Men Research Initiative. We're looking at young men. We started in early 24. There's a lot of pressure on young men to conform to being a Trumper, or being in MAGA, or certainly voting right wing, not because they care about the issues, by the way. Young men are progressive on a whole range of issues, but in terms of their party identification, in terms of their voting choices, there's an awful lot of pressure on them, because if they don't sign on to sort of Trumpism, their masculinity is called into question. They're called, beta males and cucks and soy boys and virtue signalers, and right-wing media is filled with these epithets that are thrown at men and young men who don't get with the Trump program. I would say that men who think that this is nonsense and absurd and abusive, it's schoolyard bullying, need to speak up, because we can't expect that young men are going to have the courage and the strength and the self-confidence to challenge that level of pressure and bullying if they don't hear adult men in the public conversation talking about this. And so I think we need to say that men who stand up to Trumpism, who stand up to the bullying of MAGA, is actually a measure of their strength and their integrity and their social justice consciousness. It's not a measure of them being weak or soft. It's actually they're asserting their sort of the dignity in the ways that are life affirming. And so we have to say that, but we need more men to say that, not just women.
Jackson, I'm sorry to jump in. You've hit time on that. I want to turn it over to Thomas. And Thomas, you get the last word to make your closing statements in the debate.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Jackson. I really think that this is a conversation where we probably agree on much more than we disagree with, but the disagreement I thought was productive and really respectful, so thank you for that. And I just want to end on the point that you just cannot ever predict where identity politics will lead you. In 2015, Donald Trump descended the golden staircase, quite explicitly demonizing Mexicans as rapists and criminals. And by 2024, Latino men broke to him by 19 percentage points. We talked already about abortion being on the table, and women broke to Donald Trump, knowing full well what that means for reproductive justice. In the final stretches of the campaign, and what I thought it was a low point, Kamala Harris explicitly targeted black men and as blacks with her opportunity agenda, offering them opportunities in the cannabis industry and with cryptocurrencies. And they broke by 2 percentage points towards Donald Trump. It meant nothing to them. I think it's a much more solid proposition to say, think through what you actually believe in, have a positive vision that articulates what the best American multi-ethnic future can be and how we can live up to it, and then live and fight for those values, and don't pander and fragment your message through a million different kaleidoscope lenses trying to capture everybody through immutable characteristics. Let's be Americans together. There's more that unites us than divides us. That's a winning politics, and that's the essence of liberalism that the Democrats must recapture.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And that is a wrap on this debate. I want to thank both of you, Jackson Katz and Thomas Chatterton Williams, for showing up, for having the conversation, for listening to one another, for being so civil about it. In short, for being open to debate, which is our name and also our goal. Thanks so much to all of you for being there. And once again, I want to thank those of you who joined in with questions. And I want to give a thanks to our audience for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. Thank you for listening. I just want to remind you that as a nonprofit, we are working to combat extreme polarization through what we do, civil debate. And our work is made possible by listeners like you and by the Rosencrantz Foundations and by supporters of Open to Debate. I also want to point out this debate was produced with the support of Civis, advancing the common good through investment in cultural activities that tackle pressing social issues and examine our common humanity and interdependent futures. You can get more information at civisfdn.org. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman. Our CEO is Clea Connor, and Leo Mathau is our chief content officer. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our chief advancement officer. This episode was produced by Jessica Glazer, Julia Melfi, and Marlette Sandoval. Editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer and Tom Bunting. Andrew Lipson and Max Fulton provided production support, and the Open to Debate team also includes Gabrielle Iannicelli, Annalisa Cochran, Rachel Kemp, Eric Gross, Mary Regis, and Linda Lee. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement, and I'm John Donvan. We will see you next time on Open to Debate.